Hello, class. It's me. I'm dressed down here for we'll call it dress down social distancing Monday. That I'm recording this lecture. Uh, I'll post this up for our Tuesday class, so y'all can feel free to dress down for Tuesday's class. Um, I'm here to talk about Countee Cullen's poetry. Last week we had a couple great discussions online about his work and his essays. So I want to sort of close out our Countee Cullen section with a discussion of his most famous poem, Yet Do I Marvel. But before I get into that, I did want to briefly discuss again his essay, Poet on Poet. It's basically an essay of criticism of Langston Hughes's The Weary Blues. So I'm also going to post this up on YouTube, so it'll be shareable. So for people who aren't in this class who happen to come across and see this lecture, I recommend you find that essay. It's called Poet on Poet by Countee Cullen. And it's his review of The Weary Blues by Langston Hughes. And the reason why I wanted to talk about it a little more, I thought the discussion we had was great. I just wanted to sort of solidify a couple things. The reason why I chose that particular essay, because I think it really helps crystallize what one of the things we've talked about that has come up and will continue to come up in Black American poetry is this idea of there being two poles. One is a sort of traditional poetry pole, and the other one is a vernacular poetry pole, right? And as you know, as I've said in class, I think that these poles are that the idea that you can neatly sort of separate Black poetry in two poles, I reject that notion, right? But it doesn't mean people haven't themselves sort of tried to create these sort of two separate poles. And so it's important to know that people have viewed them as, see them as existing or what have you. And so I think that essay by Countee Cullen, Poet on Poet, is a really great example, and probably the first time this dichotomy really sort of becomes solidified. And we've one of the places we looked at this was in the poetry of Paul Laurence Dunbar, which in that case it was in a lot of ways an internal struggle, right, from himself as the vernacular poet versus himself as the traditional formal poet, right? And then obviously it comes up just in the sort of, analysis. We looked at the poetry of the blues, which was not considered traditional poetry. But we also acknowledge that it shares a relationship and kinship to a traditional form, which is the ballad. And we went all the way back to Phyllis Wheatley, right? And we talked about how critiques of her were that she's sort of too traditional, too formal, not sort of her poetry is not sort of reflective of vernacular, Black speech and Black experience, right? And so these polls keep coming up, and Countee Cullen's essay is really a sort of great glimpse of that. I enjoy the essay, even though I totally disagree with Countee Cullen's analysis of his analysis of Langston Hughes. But it's interesting because you see how Countee Cullen's grappling. On the one hand, he's like, this poetry is amazing. He's talking about Langston Hughes' poetry. It's amazing. It's moving. He feels like he's at church and he's sweating reading it. It brings so much emotion. But then he tries to diss the poetry and be like, but is this poetry? Because poetry is this other special thing, right? I think he says that, the rarefied air, right? And so Countee Cullen is, in that sort of traditional formal mode of what a poet's supposed to be, whereas Langston Hughes ends up being in a sort of more experimental vernacular pole, right? And again, as I've said, these poles are problematic for many reasons. One is oftentimes people will associate, say, vernacular poetry with maybe more political, right? But we looked at Claude McKay's poetry, which his would be more like Countee Cullen in the more formal traditional poetry, but highly political, right? And Paul Laurence Dunbar, right? His poetry was vernacular poetry, but as he often expressed himself, it wasn't even necessarily poetry that he felt was entirely genuine, or spoke to his sort of true poetic desires, right? So these, these associations between vernacular and traditional poetry often fall apart when you sort of really fully scrutinize them. And I think this is also true with Countee Cullen. One, and there's for two reasons for it. One is I think Langston Hughes is actually much more of a traditional poet than maybe Countee Cullen was acknowledging. I think that he was also very experimental, and I would never take that away from Langston Hughes. But also he was highly aware of traditional poetry and constantly using it, playing with it, working with it, right? And so I think that his poetry can't be sort of separated from traditional poetry. His poetry is informed by it. He's thinking about it. He's grappling with it and working with it and against it. Countee Cullen, on the other hand, right, is a true sort of traditional poet, and he and part of this comes up with this idea of what does it mean to be a poet, and we're gonna talk about Robert Hayden next. And then we'll get into the Black Arts movement, and you see again, so it's like, am I a poet or am I a Black poet, right? And then that's where those poles again come in, right? Because there's the poet, which is the traditional poet, and then there's the Black poet, which is often associated as the vernacular poet, right? So Countee Cullen, no one could argue that he's anything other than a traditional poet for sure. His poetry is inspired by romantic poets, Percy Shelley, John Keats. He's just like Phillis Wheatley, very much informed by traditional British poetry, and so he writes in form. Yet Do I Marvel is a sonnet. As you guys know, I'm sure you picked out the rhyme scheme. You guys gotten pretty good at that now. So yeah, he's a traditional poet. His poetry is, virtually always written in some sort of strict form. And this poem is his most famous. And I think it's interesting how this poem becomes his most famous, right? Because as I said, he's pretty adamant that he's a poet, not a Black poet, right? A little background on my experience with this poetry is this, Countee Cullen's poetry and this poem in particular. Countee Cullen was one of the first poets that I really was drawn to. My mom bought me his book. It was a collected book of works called My Soul's High Song. And she gave it to me, and I just started reading it, and I was a senior in high school. And at the time, I was taking an AP English class, and I wasn't really feeling the English class, although I loved the Shakespeare segment that we learned. But we were reading Thomas Hardy, various James Joyce, James Joyce is great, but I wasn't ready for Joyce. So we were reading these writers, and I couldn't relate to them or connect with them. So I was sort of parallel while we were doing that. I was studying Countee Cullen, and because that was when I started to think of myself as, oh, maybe I'm a poet, right? And I had never seen myself that way before. And that was the first time I started to. And so it was Countee Cullen that sort of led me through that, sort of those early stages of being a poet. So I wouldn't say today that Countee Cullen is the poet who's most influenced me. I probably wouldn't say that by a long shot, but he is one of the poets. He is, probably the poet who really first turned me on to poetry. And that's one of the things about poetry is that, you're not the first writer who turned you on to poetry may not end up being the poet whose poetry you even like the most. So I wouldn't say, I love Countee Cullen's poetry more than anyone else. But there is a rhythm and song to his work that I find compelling. And this poem here, Yet Do I Marvel, was the first poem where I had that experience, right? And while like I said, I was sort of studying this in my AP English class. And so one of the things that our teacher had sort of taught us is how to look up references, right? And I think we had to buy a dictionary of mythological references because poetry and fiction, whatever, often have these intense sort of mythological references and metaphors. And so I practiced that with this poem while I was reading it, right? And I looked up all the references, I looked up the words I didn't understand, which so often, right, students don't do, right? You just sort of gloss over those words you don't know. You might Google one of them or something, but you don't spend too much time looking them up. Big mistake, right? You want to know every single word and what it means, and you want to take that time. Sometimes it gets overwhelming when you're doing especially if you're having to read an essay or something with really complicated, complex language, but you got to do it. So do that work, put it in, and I'll show you. This was sort of the first experience I had with looking up references and looking up words I didn't know, right? So what I'll do first is I'll read the poem, and then I'll flip this camera and let you guys see the poem. I mean, you guys have it in front of you. So I should have told you, pull it out, right, in your books. It also can be Googled by anybody who wants it. It's called Yet Do I Marvel. So I'll read it, and then I'll sort of go over it line by line. Okay? Cool. Yet Do I Marvel by Countee Cullen. I doubt not God is good, well-meaning, kind. And did he stoop to quibble, could tell why the little buried mole continues blind. Why flesh that mirrors him must someday die. Make plain the reason tortured Tantalus is baited by the fickle fruit. Declare if merely brute caprice dooms Sisyphus to struggle up a never-ending stair. Inscrutable his ways are, and immune to catechism by a mind too strewn with petty cares to slightly understand what awful ways compels his awful hand. Yet do I marvel at this curious thing, to make a poet black and bid him sing. That's a good poem, man. Like, it's a good poem, right? So let's take a look here. Can I flip my screen here? I should be able to, right? Why not? Can you not flip in the middle of a video? All right, well, either I can and I don't know how to, or I can't. So we'll go from there. But let me, I'll just flip the phone around and I'll show it to you so you can see it. All right, I'm gonna bring this back then to me because my original plan is I was gonna sort of flip my screen and look at it, but I don't know if I can. Maybe I can't do that in the middle of the video, so I'd be able to sort of look at it while I was talking about it. But it's fine if you want to. Like I said, you guys have the poem. Make sure you have it in front of you so that we can go over it line by line. Like I said, you can Google the poem. Okay, so. What I remember, the thing about poetry, a lot of English professors don't say this or admit this. I don't know why, but a lot of stuff, especially when you're young, you just don't get what the hell it's saying. You sort of get it. You get a little thing, a little piece. You're like, oh yeah, and and it might sound dope, right? But you don't really get what it means, And obviously there are poems that you do off the top, but a lot of poems aren't that accessible, especially if they're older, right? Or actually, there's a lot of newer poems that are hard to understand too for different reasons. But yeah, so the phrasing and stuff sometimes just throw you off, right? So what do they mean? So, and I remember having that experience to the first reading it, and I was like, yeah, I remember in the rhyme scheme and wondering oh, this is kind of cool, but really not knowing what he was saying, and it kind of totally blew me away once I really figured it out. And so I read it a little bit with the awareness of what he means, whereas if I had not known it, I would have just read the same words and maybe the inflections might have been slightly different. But let's work our way through it. Okay, so I doubt not God is good, meaning I doubt not God's good. God's dope. I know that. He's well-meaning. I say he because he says he. Kind. Um, and did he stoop to quibble? That's the first word, right? You got to look that up, right? Maybe I could have sort of pulled it up, so I had it here so I could read the dictionary definition, but I'm not going to bother. Quibble means, to bother, right? To, have a little sort of an argument, quarrel, something like that, right? And so to bother with something that's not that important, right? And did he stoop to quibble? Could tell why. So hold on. I know God's dope. I know he's cool, right? And if he wanted to bother, he could tell why. The little buried mole continues blind. Right? Now, he's just talking about an animal, right? That buried mole, right? Why does the buried mole sort of just dig without being able to see? Like not, just why does it just keep going? I'm not like a huge mole expert, so I can't, right? Maybe I should have looked that up too and known more about moles and how they work. But I got that one enough that I didn't feel too like I had to worry about that too much. The next one, why flesh that mirrors him must someday die. So remember, I doubt not God is good, meaning I know God is dope, right? And if he wanted to bother, he could explain why the buried mole continues blind, why flesh that mirrors him, why humans, us, who mirror him, meaning we are in God's image, right? So he could explain why we die, if he wanted to. Make plain the reason tortured Tantalus. Now you guys have homework. Look up Tantalus, right? So Tantalus is the Greek mythological figure who has this sort of apple that he's like trying to get to, right? And sort of stuck trying to get to that apple, right? So he could explain. So, and this is important. So let me pause there. Now he shifts to, it's not, first he's saying he can explain stuff that is day to day, right? Now he veers into the world of mythology, right? So that's a metaphorical jump, right? He makes this, so now we're not just in the sort of real, tangible, day-to-day life and experience, or the material world, as us sophisticated professors would say, right? We're no longer in the material world. Now he's going to step into mythological world. And of course, if we're talking about Greek mythology, right, we are now talking about essentially a different religion than Christianity, right? And so, why would you do that, right? For somebody who's like a serious Christian who believes in, obviously does not believe in Greek mythology, right? But that metaphorical turn, I think, does a couple things. One, it aligns him with a tradition, right? So that tradition of British poetry is constantly in conversation with earlier European writing, and and certainly the Greeks, right? Homer, etc., right? So that's one, to sort of to continue to be part of that tradition, right? But I also think two is to stretch the bounds of God's power and God's ability. God's not simple. Like, it's easy for God to explain why humans would die, right? That's nothing, right? But he could explain like the most crazy things, the most fantastical things that you can't even imagine, right? So that's why I think he makes that turn. So, make plain the reason tortured Tantalus is baited by the fickle fruit. Declare if merely brute caprice dooms Sisyphus to struggle up a never-ending stair. Who's Sisyphus? Who's Sisyphus? Y'all look that up yet? Sisyphus is another, right? Greek is, Greek, another reference to Greek mythology, right? And so Sisyphus is the guy who has to push the boulder up the hill, and he pushes the boulder up, and then when he gets to the top, he has to start over again, right? And so brute, meaning strength, Caprice meaning, can I explain? You know what? We're doing this like real talk, so I'm gonna look it up. So, because I'm like, can I actually give you the proper definition? So let me do this. The other thing, and y'all gotta like respect this. When we had, whatever, I know it's like old heads trying to talk like, oh, back in the day, blah, blah. But like straight up, when we had to look stuff up, it was hard, bro. Like you had to like go look. I mean, some things you just looked in the dictionary, but some things weren't in the dictionary. So you had to go find where you're supposed to look this thing up, right? So just remember that, yeah. Because some of y'all don't look up your references, and it's so easy to look them up. Right now, I know some of the real professor heads out there like, yes, but we don't want our students just Googling and getting the basic information from Wikipedia and all that. And I hear you, which they're right. It's not like they're wrong. It's just that it's good to know something. And all professors do the same thing. We all Google stuff. It's not like we don't Google stuff. We just know that after we Google it, we know to look into more, deeper sources, right? That have more, that have the more sort of specific, reliable, and sophisticated or nuanced meanings, right? Okay, so for caprice, sudden, unpredictable change, as of one mind's or the weather, a tendency to change one's mind without apparent or adequate motive, right? So is Sisyphus just like, he just keeps saying, well, I guess I got to do the boulder again, right? I guess I just got to do it again. He's strong. He can push the boulder. Not everybody can do that. Guess I just got to do it again, right? Like, it's like a, an animal or whatever playing with a toy and they can't stop, right? Is that what it is? Is it just that simple? Or is it, is there more to it as to why he's stuck there? Why Sisyphus is sort of stuck on that mountain with that boulder, right? God could explain that. God's dope. God knows like all sorts of stuff. He could explain all that. That's what Countee Cullen's telling us. Then he says, oh, and let's backtrack, right? You guys know the rhyme scheme, right? So we have A, B, A, A, B, A, B, right? And then we have C, D, C, D. So kind, Y, blind, die, right? A, B, A, B, right? Some of y'all could argue that's A, right? But we're for now we're going with perfect rhyme. Tantalus declare, Sisyphus stare, right? So C, D, C, D, right? And then we get into the next quatrain. Inscrutable his ways are and immune to catechism by a mind too strewn. Inscrutable. What does that mean? Inscrutable means like beyond scrutiny. Like you can't even bother to attempt to question him, God, right? Unquestionable, kind of. His ways are. So his ways are unquestionable. We can't get into that. That's beyond us, right? He's too dope for us to be able to try to be like, oh, well, we're going to try to say, why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? Right? We can't do that because we're not dope like him. And immune. He's immune. God's immune to catechism. Catechism essentially meaning criticism, right? He's immune to criticism by a mind too strewn. Our minds are too strewn. Strewn meaning filled with unimportant stuff. Well, we have stuff thrown in there. He says the unimportant stuff after. He says, by a mind too strewn with petty cares. So strewn meaning stuff is sort of all over the place. And what's all over the place is the petty cares, right? Our heads are full of petty cares. It's kind of true, right? I'm not gonna lie. Like I spend a lot of time, sometimes more time than I should, thinking about like some petty stuff that I really don't need to be thinking about. So fair enough, right? So inscrutable his ways are and immune to catechism. He's unquestionable. You can't question him. And he's immune to criticism from people who are just spending their time thinking about petty things, right? To slightly understand. So remember, a mind too strewn with petty cares, meaning a mind full of petty stuff, to slightly understand. So now he's dissing humans twice. He's saying, y'all is wrapped up in petty stuff. I said stuff. Kids can still watch this video. With petty stuff, to slightly understand. We couldn't possibly understand what awful brain compels his awful hand. Now, that is easy to read in the current way we would use the word awful, meaning bad. But I don't think he means awful exactly that way. Awful, full of awe, is kind of like awesome, right? So awful could mean like, let's say there was a really intense lightning storm, and it was awful, like this awful lightning storm. Awful meaning scary. It's the crazy ass lightning storm. I did swear a little bit there, but it's okay. But also awesome, right? Because it's like so intense, right? So awful meaning like so full of awe, so intense, right? So our mind is too strewn with petty stuff to even begin to understand what awful brain compels his awful hand. What intense brain compels his intense hand. His hand meaning things he does. You know, your hand is like that's like you use that to mean like like whatever. I guess someone could be he died at his hand, meaning that person killed him, right? So what awful brain compels his awful hand, right? So we're too caught up. We can't be criticizing God. We got no ability to even understand how intense that dude is, right? So again, we went from, so that was the third quatrain, right? So that went, E, F, right? So, oh, sorry, wrong. Oh, I can't believe I almost messed that up. That would have been terrible, right? This is important. It's important. It doesn't do E, F. So, as I said, the first two quatrains, kind, why, blind, die. A, B. Next quatrain, Tantalus declare, Sisyphus stare. C, D. So, what we're expecting is another, so the A, B format, which would be E, F. But he does immune strewn hand, understand hand, which is E, F. Why does that matter, class? Because then what ends is GG. We know that, right? Why is that significant? I'm waiting. Oh, I think one of you got it. Okay, good. The ending is a Petrarchan ending, right? Where it goes, the 6 lines are rhyming, 6 lines of rhyming couplets, which the Petrarchan ending has a couple variations, but one of them is 6 lines of rhyming couplets, right? As opposed to the Shakespearean ending, which continues that A-B format, right? And then ends with one closing a rhymed couplet, right? So he breaks that form just slightly. You can almost barely tell, because this, I would say, is a Shakespearean sonnet for sure, right? But it's a Shakespearean with a sort of Petrarchan twist at the end, right? And for Countee Cullen, he definitely, like, that's intended. I mean, everything poets do is intended, but this is like really intended, right? He wants us to know. He wants me to literally be sitting here about 100 years after he wrote this poem and make sure I mention that he went with that Petrarchan ending, right? And so, yeah, so we've now gone into that ending, and so that allows us to do the Petrarchan ending, but it also does something fascinating, because there's like 2 different turns. In the Shakespearean, the turn is at the closing couplet, right? What kind of couplet do we call that? The heroic couplet, right? Because the heroic couplet is like almost like a poem by itself, right? It's 2 lines, and it's just by itself. It already stands for something, right? the turn in the Petrarchan sonnet is in that closing sestet. What is sestet? 6 lines, right? The turn can happen at different places, and the Petrarchan is not so rigid. And the Shakespearean, well, I don't know if rigid is the right word. The way the turn happens, it'll be slightly. And if you guys want to get real deep into it, you go look up some of Petrarch's Italian sonnets, or John Milton wrote a bunch of them. A lot of people have. But anyway, I've gotten off topic there. So there's also a turn when he gets to the inscrutable his ways are, right? Before, it's the first 8 lines is all, I know God is dope, and if he wanted to bother, he could explain all this stuff. And then in the last 6 lines, he transitions to human beings, they can't mess with God. They can't even be talking to God, right? Like they're too full of petty stuff to begin to talk to God. I think that a lot of y'all probably resonate with that, right? Like a lot of y'all go to church, practice pretty, seriously, right? And that seems to probably make sense today. 100 years later, still makes sense, right? So that's where that turn is. But then there's another turn at the closing couplet, right? There's another turn there, and that's important. Yet do I marvel at this curious thing. Colon. We don't see no colons anywhere. All of a sudden, you got a colon, right? And colon, we use that, sometimes described as a headline, right? Like you use the colon and then you throw out the thing that's like, oh, pay attention to this, for rent, apartment, I don't know, whatever. You get what I'm saying, right? Like colon, then headline, right? And so the headline is to make a poet black and bid him sing. So remember, God's dope. God could explain why the mole is continuing blind, could explain why we're going to die someday, right? He could explain the most fantastical things you could think of. All those things. Easy he could explain that, right? And we're too petty to even try to question him. Like, we don't even deserve to question him, right? But kind of questions him, right? And he says, none of that surprised me. God could explain it all. But I marvel, meaning I'm in awe of this curious, right? This like odd, interesting thing. That God would make a poet black and bid him sing. Bid him sing, meaning compel him, insist that he write poetry. What's that about? Well, we've talked about this. It's the Harlem Renaissance. We know Phyllis Wheatley got some recognition as a poet. We know some mild recognition for some other poets after that. And we know Paul Laurence Dunbar definitely received recognition as James Weldon Johnson as well. But essentially the idea that poetry was something black people did was not recognized by Western society, which is the society that Cullen's living in. Now we know, first of all, it's like, who decides who's a poet, right? There were black poets before there were white poets. We know that, right? But you're growing up in Western society, you're listening to Western values, and all you know is poets are white. And so the thing Countee Cullen is saying, right, is of all the things under the sun, nothing shocks me. That's how dope God is. Except that I can't believe he made me, this poet, a black man, a poet, and gave me the ability to write poems. To him, like, his calling is to be a poet, and he's shocked that God would do that. And what does that say? right? Like, it says many different things. One, it obviously reveals his own insecurity, right? His insecurity about being, what it means to be a poet, right? But also, it shows how God, at least, in the sort of Western psyche, right, has failed Black people, right? Like, why aren't all these great poets? Why haven't they been Black, right? And again, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that's even true. It's actually farcical, right? There have been Black poets forever. We know that. We read the blues. The blues artists were writing poems, and all the gospel songs. All those are basically poems, right? And we know Phyllis Wheatley was an amazing poet who somehow came here from Africa when she was a girl and was writing these like full-length book poems by before she reached 20, right? So, we know that's a farce. But we're trying to get into the mind of Countee Cullen, which, for the record, if I was a new critic, I would say it doesn't matter what he was thinking. It doesn't matter the historical time or whatever. That's all irrelevant to the poem. What matters is the poem. Fine, whatever. You can think that. I'm interested, right, and where his mind is at and in that time period. I think that matters, right? And so, he's so devoted to God that nothing surprises him about God except that somehow God gave him the ability to be a poet. That to him is shocking. And it reveals the world he lived in, how racist it was, and how few opportunities there were for Black people, and how challenging that was, right? And that's the thing. And you guys had a wonderful conversation about incident in that poem and the speaker, right? Which we actually know Countee Cullen did go to Baltimore when he was a kid. We know that's basically him, right? His two most famous poems are Incident and Yet Do I Marvel. And Countee Cullen is like the traditional poet over here in the pole of traditional poetry. And it's like, I'm a poet, I'm not a Black poet, right? But his most powerful poems, or at least maybe they're not, I don't know. His most recognized poems are his poems about experiencing being Black and racism, right? That's like what, the takeaway, right, from his work. And that's the takeaway from this poem, right? And so, you can't ascribe too rigidly, at least. You can say there's certain characteristics of poetry like this and certain characteristics often associated with certain poetry like this. But you can't say, vernacular poetry is political, traditional poetry is apolitical or not concerned with political issues. You can't do that, right? Just like you can't say, traditional poetry is rhymed and not traditional poetry isn't rhymed. Also ludicrous. Thanks and Hughes rhymed, as I'm going to show you later on in the semester. Nicki Minaj rhymes, right? Biggie Smalls rhymed, right? So rhyme is not just of the traditionalists, right? But Countee Cullen is a traditionalist, and he used this work to sort of work through his own insecurities, his own issues, and try to find his place in the world, right? Last thing, last nerd moment, that last line, yet do I marvel at this curious thing. Sorry, it's not the last line, second to last line. Yet do I marvel at this curious thing. 11 syllables. This poem is written in what we would call strict iambic pentameter. If you remember, lines of iambic pentameter are 10-syllable lines, right? Written in 5, it's called pent, meaning 5 feet of iambs, right? And iambs are da-da, 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 right? There's an extra syllable there, which in contemporary poetry especially, and also in some of Langston Hughes' sonnets, right, well, very much so in his sonnets. He doesn't stick to a specific, he didn't necessarily stick to 14 lines. Although his sonnets, he calls them unsonnets. So, but regardless, back to Countee Cullen. Countee Cullen is a traditional formalist, right? So like he's not going to break syllable count, right? He's not going to do that. But he did. Now, I would think what he's probably doing is taking the word curious and sort of squishing it into a 2-syllable word. Curious, right? That makes sense. But even that, for Countee Cullen, that's a little bit of a break from traditional, right? And to be clear, the traditional poets, they also broke rhythm and meter. Like, that's the point, right? Like, you set up a sort of set of rules, and then you may vary from them. Like, the rules are the guide, right? But the poet has flexibility there. And most traditional poetry, the rules are more rigid, but there's still flexibility. And then as you get to more contemporary stuff, the rules are broken a lot more frequently. But Countee Cullen was not a rule breaker. So, coincidence that he broke the rule here? No, I don't think so. Not at the turn, right? The closing couplet, the heroic couplet, he says, "Yet do I marvel at this curious thing." I'm going to break from the traditional syllable count, right? In order to add a little extra weight to what I think is really the most amazing thing for him personally under the sun. That God produced a black poet and gave him the ability to write. So that's the poem, y'all. Cool. I'm gonna post this up on YouTube, and y'all will be watching this link. So let me know your thoughts, and that's it. All right, peace out.